gravity can mess up your subwoofer plans. Hello, I'm Tim with subwoofer.tools. Subwoofer.tools is a free-to-use website to design basic ported and sealed enclosures. Today, on this video, we're going to cover whether or not your woofer works in a horizontal plane. All subwoofers will work firing on a vertical plane, like this, but some of them can be downfired and some of them can be upfired. If this is the kind of content you want to see on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe down below. We're going to have a lot more of this kind of content moving forward. Not all subwoofers want to be upfired and downfired. All of them work on the vertical plane, but not all of them will fire if they're mounted on the horizontal plane. On the horizontal plane, gravity pulls the woofer a little bit out of homeostasis. It's going to pull it down a little bit. How do we determine which drivers are good candidates for a downfiring operation? It's relatively simple. We just need to know approximately how much Earth's gravitational pull is going to work against our subwoofer to pull it out of equilibrium. Just going to pull it down just a tiny little bit. Anything more than 5%, and you're pretty much going to have to run it vertical. We can determine the percentage of sag, that's what we would call this, through a couple of small parameters. We're going to need to know the driver's resonant frequency and the driver's Xmax. In my previous video, we did discuss the all small parameters. It's just a simple, consistent mathematical model for loudspeaker drivers. It's a bunch of numbers applied to definitions and given some units, some of which are unitless. Think of subwoofers as algebra, but fun! The parameters we need to work with today are frequency response and Xmax. In my previous video about efficiency bandwidth product, you know that Fs is the resonating frequency of the subwoofer in free air. The new one we're going to talk about today is called Xmax, and that is how far the woofer moves in a linear fashion. We apply X voltage and amperage to it, aka wattage, and it moves a specific amount of distance, given that. When we push past that linear, it becomes non-linear and it compresses a little bit, and that's okay. We want to make sure that gravity isn't pulling our subwoofer too far out of equilibrium. The formula for determining this is 24,849 divided by the product of Fs squared times Xmax. How they came up with that? I saw a long time ago about how somebody much smarter than myself had determined the 24,849 number based on the pull of gravity and the mass in air. Just like I said, somebody much smarter than me figured this out. I'm just passing on the knowledge to you. What does this formula actually tell us? Well, it tells us that percentage sag is inversely proportional to Xmax and doubly so Fs. But why? With Xmax, it's pretty straightforward. You're going to have two woofers. One of them is going to have a little bit of linear movement, and the other one's going to have a lot of linear movement. If they're both affected by gravity the same actual distance, the one with a lot of movement still has a greater percentage of linear movement, where this guy over here has none. To put it in numbers, if we have a woofer with a 6mm Xmax and it's pulled down 0.6 millimeters, that's 10% sag, and we're really going to want to use that woofer in the vertical plane. We want it to fire into the room, not into the floor or up towards your headliner. On the other hand, a woofer with an 18mm Xmax with only a 0.6 millimeter sag only has a 3% sag as opposed to 10%. As a percentage, it's much lower. Fs, on the other hand, is a little bit different. There are two things that can drive an Fs up, one of which being a much lower mass, and a lower mass is less affected by gravity. The other part that makes a higher Fs number is how stiff the suspension is. If you think about tuning a guitar and you ratchet up the tension in it, the frequency goes up. Well, that's the same thing with a subwoofer. If the suspension is much stiffer, pulled a little bit tighter, it's going to ring at a higher frequency. Let's put a couple of subwoofers through the math. We'll start off with a Rockford Fosgate Prime R2D2 12. This is a dual voice coil subwoofer with dual 2-ohm voice coils. This features an Fs of 34.6 Hz and an Xmax of 6.4 millimeters. Now, if we take 24,849 and divide it by 34.6 squared times 6.4, we end up with a 3.1% sag. Gravity is only going to pull it down 3.1% of its linear Xmax. Pretty cool. We can make this woofer fire up, down, right, left, A, B, start, select. I should mention before going any further that just about every modern car audio designed subwoofer is going to pass this test. You'll be able to fire them all up and fire them all down. Some of the home audio specific drivers are going to be a little bit different, but the reason with car audio is because there is such a demand for performance. There's such a demand for excursion. There's such a demand for SPL that even the entry-level woofers, like the Rockford Fosgate that I talked about earlier, is going to be upfireable and downfireable simply because of its large Xmax. Like I said, some home audio drivers are going to have a lower Xmax because they're marketed more for sound quality. Some home audio drivers will be a little bit different, mostly because they're going to either have a super low FS or they're going to have a bit lower Xmax. I had to go back 30 years to find an example of a car audio specific subwoofer that you should just point at your headlights instead of your headliner. The Rockford Fosgate PCH12-4, the 4-ohm version of the Rockford Fosgate Punch 12, the first generation from the 90s, has a 32 hertz FS and only a 4.7 millimeter Xmax. Now this was like the street beater's drug of choice, right? You popped the trunk, you saw a couple of Rockfords and everybody was like, oh, and yeah, this thing does not have enough Xmax where it's a good idea to do it, because if you take 32 squared, multiply it by 4.7, divide it by 24,849, take the inverse of that, and you get 5.1% sag. And there you have it. Again, I had to go back 30 years to find one. I kept looking through like older and older materials until I stumbled across that one. I hope you learned a little bit more today about subwoofer parameters and how they work to determine box requirements. If you made it this far in the video, let me know by commenting headliners, not headlights, below. Thank you.